almost 21. And the first dam removal project I worked on was the Brownsville Dam removal. It was located on the Calapooya River, not too far from here. And it was what we refer to as a dinky little dam. It's about 7 feet tall. And but at the time, it was one of the first dams that was removed in Oregon. And regulators were really afraid. There was a lot of fear and uncertainty. So they created all sorts of barriers in terms of like unreasonable amounts of data that need to be required. You know, it was like 13,000 cubic yards of gravel that the river needed downstream. Like, it was a very clear win, but there's a lot of uncertainty and fear. But that was one of our first in Oregon. And then I had the great opportunity to work on these 3 dam removals in the Rogue River Basin, which were monumental in some ways because they sort of unzipped the main stem Rogue River. So they're, we've eliminated the dams on the Rogue River. And those also contributed to sort of the learning along the way of like, what is dam removal, what happens, what are the risks, what are the rewards. And that gets us to sort of modern day this past year, where we saw 3, ultimately 4 dams removed from the Klamath River, the world's largest river restoration, right at the border between Oregon and California. And so over those years, we've learned a lot from these small projects to these larger projects, and it's given me this really wonderful opportunity to spend time in and on the rivers of Oregon to do this place-based learning, but also think about like how these ideas generalize to bigger spaces. But it also has given me this opportunity to work with this amazing group of people. These are a bunch of these badass women I've had the opportunity to learn from and be inspired by. Scientists that spend their lives studying and admiring and learning about these river systems that we work in. So it's been a great joy and a great opportunity in my life to get to work on this. And it is part of a broader movement across the nation to address a key part of our aging infrastructure. So does anyone know what the average age of dams is in the United States? 80 to 100 years. 64 is a good guess. It's around 60. And the other way that we sort of think about the statistic is that over 70% of our dams are over the age of 50. And as someone who's like sees that age on the horizon, I can tell that is like, I can tell you that's a place in your life where you spend more time and energy kind of keeping things going and functioning the way you expect them to. And dams are the same. So as dams get older, we spend more time on them and more energy, and we reevaluate whether they're still valuable. And so a lot of what you're seeing in the landscape here is a bunch of old dams that have been removed. The color combinations here are the red, the things I draw your attention to are the red and the tannish color. They're a little washed out, but those are smaller, right? So like the order of like 30 feet or less. And the vast majority of dams that we're moving are on that scale, right? There's only a few of them that are that light blue color, and those are the bigger ones. So we're on a very biased sort of sample. We're moving small dams across the United States. So one question is, well, why are we doing that? And that's what this talk is about. Like more broadly, how do we get to this decision to remove dams? So we're going to focus less on data and more on this process. Like, how do we get to these wins around this aging infrastructure that we have to do something with, and making decisions about that? And so what I'm going to argue is that it's related to questions around project complexity, regulations, which is everyone's favorite topic, but is actually really important, and then trust. So that's what we're going to do in the next 15-20 minutes. So project complexity as an engineer, for me, is like a really obvious explanation for why we remove smaller dams. The smaller projects are easier. Just like, this project on the top is the Brownsville Dam removal. It was removed in probably 3 days with a hydraulic thumb and a backhoe. So very easy logistically versus the Klamath Dam removals, right? There was 4 of them. They had to be sequenced. There was a lot of equipment involved, a lot of sediment activity. Very different types of projects. In Project Collapse, you can tell this figure is made by an engineer because there's like no design associated with it. But it tells an important story. We developed this as part of trying to make some predictions about cost drivers of dam removals and its relationship to sort of project complexity. And so that first thing that is listed here illustrates, like, is it more, from a construction perspective, is it more complex? Like, do you need helicopters, like on the Elwha Dam removals? Do you need helicopters to drop equipment in, to mobilize equipment? Do you need a copper dam, is like this big temporary dam? Like, is it complicated or easy to remove? But the other piece that's important that we'll spend some time unpacking in here is whether the infrastructure is going to be missed. Will that reservoir be missed? And there's kind of 2 aspects to that. One is like like public identity. There are so many of these dams, people have like their first kiss there, or they have water ski there for every summer for the last 30 years. And those can generate like real and significant sort of conflicts and sources of loss, generally real genuine grief. And so those also can lead to things like litigation, where people really start to battle around losing this infrastructure, even if it's not theirs to sort of, it doesn't belong to them, but they still, it's part of their identity, part of their lifestyle. The other aspect of that, though, is whether it's serving a function that can't easily be replaced. So when we talk about it being missed, I don't mean just like culturally do we miss it, I mean do we miss the dam's function. And so that is in part explained by this figure. We generated this big database around dam removals and back during the COVID days. And what this illustrates is the vast majority of our dams that are being removed are hydroelectric projects. And part of the reason for that is because it's really easy to replace hydropower. Power generation is really easy to replace, but like flood regulation, that's a much harder thing to replace. So essentially it's a question of replaceability. We can replace hydroelectric power. And I have, I did this podcast, which is really kind of awkward and cringy, but I heard some really interesting things from some folks when I did that. And one of them was from this guy that worked at PacifiCorp, who helps like provide this metaphor, essentially of the power grid is a big bathtub with a bunch of hoses going into it. And it's like thousands of hoses going to the power grid, and they're all flowing at a really high rate. And if you just turn off a small one, the grid kind of doesn't notice because there's so much wind, there's so much solar coming in. So for hydroelectric projects, it's really easy to add that capacity back. But if we're talking about something like some water storage projects, and that could be for like drinking water supply, irrigation, or flood storage, those are functions that are much more difficult to replace. Oh, did I see from here? Okay. So like, for example, we live in the floodplain. We are all sitting in the Willamette Valley floodplain right now. And so if we were to remove, the Army Corps of Engineers operates 13 flood regulation projects upstream. If we were to remove those, not right now, but in the winters, this area would be flooded. And so those are functions that are much more difficult to replace, much more likely to maintain those dams in perpetuity. Okay, so then the last reason that we're removing hydroelectric projects at a high rate is this agency called FERC that's got this weird sort of authoritarian logo that doesn't really relate to anything as far as I can tell, but it's known as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And they're really important because they issue permits. If you operate a coal plant or a hydropower plant, you have to get a permit from FERC, and you've got to get a new one every 25 or 50 years. And when you do, they make you meet like modern requirements, like environmental and other standards. So FERC actually is one of those agencies that can really drive dam removal. And so this is how we get to environmental regulations. Oftentimes, those of us who work in restoration or work in rivers think of regulations as a hindrance. And to help illustrate that point, I put together this nice diagram of all the agencies that relate to, if you own a dam that might have some connection to it or some regulations or authority over it. And so the top part is the federal agencies, the alphabet soup of federal agencies. The bottom part are state agencies. And then if you are in an enlightened enough group, you might actually have the tribes consulted. Not always the case, but so it's a lot of folks, a lot of agencies involved. And so typically when people think about regulations, they think about things like fragmentation, that they're rigid, they're not really flexible in terms of adapting to the needs of the system or the infrastructure. I can't read this kind of glasses. Thank you, irrelevant. Or obtuse is really hard to understand. And so for a lot of folks, those of us working in rivers, this is a sort of perception of what regulations do. But there are also cases where these regulations can drive decisions to dam removal. And FERC is one example, as I mentioned, getting a new license. Another one that can be important is the National Flood Insurance Program, which again, most of us tend to think of as like a totally dysfunctional aspect of the federal government. But there are cases where it has led to dam removal, such as the Nelson Dam, which was on the Yakima River. And its primary motivation for removal was to reduce flood risk. Essentially, it was flooding communities upstream, so the primary justification and funding came from the National Flood Insurance Program. So there are cases where regulations can actually help lead to decisions and win-wins around dam removals, right? Reduce flood risk, improve fish passage, improve conditions for the ecosystem. So, they tend to be fragmented, they tend to be problematic, but there are cases where, we can get to decisions around dam removals that are wins for everyone through regulatory processes. Then the last part that I will introduce around this sort of general concept before talking about the Klamath is that this diagram that I saw at an American Rivers workshop recently that I really liked from Rosa Gonzalez, which is that reminds us that making decisions and getting to decisions moves at the speed of trust. And I have seen this play out in my personal life as much as my work life, that you have to build that trust before you can do big things. And so most of us, it's really washed out, but most of us are working on the informed side, like the level on the very far left. It's where like what we're doing right now, like where I'm talking at you. But like the real work that happens is on the other end of the spectrum. And it just takes a ton of time and energy and collective sort of goodwill and graciousness to get to that point. But that's when those really big things happen. And so I have this quote from someone I deeply admire, who unfortunately is no longer with us, Chris Stein with the Department of Environmental Quality. But this is a sort of, in my mind, a framing of that same concept on the Klamath River. He was the environmental regulator that issued the water quality permit for the state of Oregon. And he said, not everybody was in favor of dam removal on the Klamath, but the removal of the dams was the solution that solved everyone's problems. And it really took literally 30 years of advocacy and effort on behalf of a lot of people to build that trust and to get to that decision. So that's the setup to get us this question. Is it a project like a Lego set, for example? It has a hopefully a finite set of outcomes. It's a really clear set of directions and pretty easy to follow. Or is it like a production, like an IKEA assembly, where you need to like phone a bunch of friends and have a bunch of cocktails for anything to sort of come together? And so that sort of leads us to the dam removal side of things. Is it a stinky little dam, or is it a big scale Klamath project? And so another picture from David Baker on how this process led to the dam removal of Klamath. And I really like this image in particular because it shows you all sorts of things that happen at the site, right? You've got the algae that was growing in the reservoirs, turning things green. You've got this dysfunctional fish ladder. You've got the river downstream that's dewatered because it's shipping all the water off to the hydroelectric plant. There's just all the problems that are sort of concentrated in this one image. And these dams did serve a really important function. They helped electrify a rural part of northern California, generated around 170 megawatts of power, which powers around 50,000 homes at a time like around 100 years ago when that was an important sort of function for this part of the world. And these are the cast of characters. The Iron Gate Dam was the lowest. It was around 173 feet, and Kopko was around 130 feet. These are all gone at this point. They've been removed. The river's been reconnected. But on the Klamath, that process was driven by this hydropower facility. They were hydroelectric projects, and they were subject to FERC relicensing, so they had to apply for a permit. And on the surface, ultimately, this is what drove the decision. They had to provide fish passage for threatened and endangered species in the river, and that was a lot of money. And so ultimately, the sort of cynical side of me is this is a money decision. That's what the Pacific Corp tell you, right? And their shareholders didn't have to pay anything. The Berkshire Hathaway didn't pay for it. We did, the taxpayers did, and ratepayers did. So they were able to unload their sort of financial burden on to the rest of us. So it's a big win for them. So when we think about win-wins, it was a big win for Berkshire Hathaway. If any of us are part of that, I can't say I am myself, but some people really won from that. But there were a bunch of other wins as well. Right? So there was a big fish disease risk issue, which still persists today, but is different now. This is a juvenile salmon with its gut spilling out. It has been infected by a pathogen. It infects around 90% of the juvenile fish did at the time before dam removal, and essentially creates a big gut rot issue. So it's a significant impact on the fish. There's a big cyanobacteria bloom that these reservoirs were full of toxic cyanobacteria. They impacted water quality so badly that they led to fish kills. So they were problematic for a bunch of reasons. And there's a bunch of wins associated with this. They're not just ecological orientation. My research, which I'm not presenting in on today, was on the water quality side of things, but we also worked on the restoration of people. That was a huge part of the story in terms of wins for the community. So I know that so most of you probably weren't watching on this date in November 22nd, but it was for some of us, it was like one of those moments in life where you kind of know where you were, right? Like for me, it was in 9/11 or when Barack Obama got elected. Like those are these moments in time that are like cemented in your memory. And this is the same, that was one of those moments for me where like pushing refresh. As FERC was voting to figure out like, is this gonna happen? So this was the moment where it was like, wait, and then it was go. And literally within weeks, they had construction equipment on the site. Within months, the first dam was open. And those of us who like to think about organizing life into timelines, try to put things on a timeline, this is one version of that where this really started way back at a fish kill that happened in the early 2000s that mobilized the tribes. They started showing up in really public ways. And then there were a bunch of agreements that built and destroyed trust over the next 2 decades. And these were like legal documents and regulations that ultimately led to the dam removal and where we are today. However, I want to close with just a few slides to document or talk about some of the things that were not in the timeline that really lead to these types of win-win projects. And the first is on this concept of the decades of indigenous resistance. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about resistance to the dam removals, I'm talking about resistance to like leaving the river and degradation of the river. And they worked really hard. They were a huge part of the dam removal process. And I also want to be really clear, this is definitely not my story to tell. I want to share this stuff with you. I think it's really important, but it's not my version or not my story to tell. It was just a great book, and it's on Spotify. If y'all want to read it or listen to it, I like to listen to it because Amy reads the book, and also her family like sings in it, so it's a cool way to learn the story about how their family has been through, taken a leadership role in this over many years. And so just to illustrate some of these examples of that, there were a lot of social protests. This is stuff maybe that we recognize in our own lives, things that we can do, like this public-facing activism that we participate in. But there was these other efforts that were sort of more latent. One example was this court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Ray Matz went to the Supreme Court with this case, and essentially he refused to quit fishing when there was a fishing ban. So the commercial fishing was still open, the tribal fishing was closed that year, and he just kept showing up. They kept taking his nets, arresting him. He got arrested 14 or 15 times. Finally sued the state of California, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court, who reaffirmed that they already had the rights to fish and they already had the rights to the land. So it was in these small ways over many years that the tribes kept showing up. Another is this example of the salmon wars in the late 70s, and this is a pretty dark moment in the history of the Klamath River. So I want to give you a second to read some words from a Yurok tribal member. So rather than me reading it, you can read it in your own words. But for me, these words are pretty profound and remind me of what the tribes have had to do to protect their own lives and livelihoods. So I'll give you just a second to read this.
Can you all see it out there?
Would y'all rather me read it? Can people see it? Yeah, sure, I can read. Well, I can't read it from here. All right, during 1978 and 79, something happened every day. It was a constant. We were afraid to ride in our cars alone. Whenever we planned a trip to the store, more than one person had to go. We were just scared all of the time. We were down on the beach and we had to pretend net in. It had buoys and a line, but it had no webbing on it. Here came the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, law enforcement officers. They rushed onto the beach and they threw nets over the top of us and maced us. Your body is stinging, your face is stinging, everything is stinging. You're trying to get out, but because you're stinging, you can't get out of the net. This guy comes by and he kicks me in the leg. I was offended. It was like, what? Not that I'm maced, not that I'm under this net, but that he kicked me. I immediately got out, and here's this big guy in full riot gear. I got up on my tippy toes and I just grabbed him and pulled him down to me and I said, "You listen to me. You ever do something like that to me again and I'll kill you." And I meant it. And like I said, those words, I feel like it's a little bit hard for a lot of us to recognize in our own lives, like the courage that it took for the tribes to stay on their land, to stay advocating for the river. And so that's this fearlessness and this unfaltering commitment that I think is so important to getting to some of these wins. And then I'll just also quickly mention, I know a lot of folks think about Indigenous knowledge, and that's really important, but they have also contributed, it's washed out, they have been such leaders on the Western science side of things. The tribes have been and really important in terms of advancing our knowledge of how the river works in a lot of different ways, from water quality to fisheries. They have been the lead, taken the lead, and led that through the process. So lastly, I want to just comment on some leadership of individuals, some champions within the environmental permitting world, which again, not everybody's favorite topic, but it is actually really one of the most important things that leads to these types of projects. You may notice in this plot that I showed earlier that there's a geographic distribution, right? Like the West Coast, the left coast, but also the Northeast and some parts of the Midwest really do a good job with removing a lot of dams. And there's a reason for that. Those states have created, through that sort of diagram of permits, have created pathways and funding mechanisms for us to do something about this aging infrastructure. And so there's very much we're just trying to get illustrating here, this pathway that have been created by some states that make it more accessible. So I want to take a couple slides to acknowledge a couple people on the Klamath who really did an amazing job with this. This is this guy, Clayton Krieger. He's from the state of California on the dam removal side. He led a lot of work to help and mandate that we document the impacts of the dams in terms of the basin-wide water quality issues, which set the stage for when the FERC relicensing process happened. FERC had to address those issues. So not only did he lead this effort to help document those the impacts of the dams and water quality, but then set some standards. TMDL is an acronym that we throw around a lot. It's essentially a water quality standard. And so not only did they document the effects, but then they also documented, created a law, a standard by which these dams had to meet. And without that, the FERC wouldn't have had to require these water quality standards in the first place. So again, the role of individual champions and permitting can be truly profound. The other one is this guy, Chris Stein, that I mentioned before. This is a quote from the water quality permit. We call it 401 certification. But this is truly profound. He has changed how we do things in the state of Oregon. And in this case, this is a quote from the certification, from the permit. The DEQ, their Department of Environmental Quality, finds the proposed activity will temporarily cause lowering of water quality, however, will improve water quality and result in long-term ecological benefit. Which in itself is a really profound and sort of provocative thing to say, but what's more important is that back in 2012, he went to the state and modified the state rules, with the state legislature, to allow short-term exceedances, to allow a restoration project to degrade water quality for a short period of time with conditions. And so that is truly profound, which for those of us who work in rivers appreciate, it is a truly profound impact of these types of projects that is transformative to other restoration projects, because the prior rule is that you weren't allowed to degrade water quality at all. And so allowing these short-term exceedances provides for restoration in ways that are otherwise not possible. So to wrap up, I'm going to show you some images from the Klamath that help clarify how we get to these wins. This is sonar, which is essentially sound waves that they send out to the water, and you can document things. And in this came from Cal Trout, who was helping monitor salmon. And in that little sliver right there is the first salmon that passed the former Iron Gate site 2 days after the dam was breached. So within 2 days, the dam was breached, fish were already migrating past the site. In October of 2023. And this is an image from Julie Alexander, she's a colleague of mine, taken 1 month after the dam removal, and one of the tributaries that leads into the reservoir. And you can see these ragtag Chinook that are in these tributaries spawning, these cold, clear tributaries they haven't seen in 100 years, spawning after the dam, that last dam was breached. And then let's see if it's going to work. So Yeah. Okay, well, I can tell you what it is. This is, so there are 4 dams that were removed, there's 2 more upstream, and this was the first dam that passed one of the next upstream dams. So they both have fish ladders. They weren't designed for salmon passage, but we see on this date, September of last year, the first salmon moving upstream. And this is how we got to, like, there are salmon all over that basin now. They have spawned and or have actually, like, this month, the last 3 months, have been leaving the system. So naturally spawned juveniles leaving the system for the first time in over 100 years, starting with this fish that made it early fish ladder at Keno. All right, so another quote from Christine: "The power of the river to be restored should never be underestimated," and I think that's a clear message from, not just the Klamath. Like, this is the case for a lot of dam removals. Like, there's the story is the recovery is quick and profound. So as we think about, like, getting to these win-wins with dam removal, we got to address complexity, regulatory environment, and have leadership there, and then building trust. And then the last 2 things I would add is this unfaltering commitment. The tribes have really demonstrated that to us. I've struggling with that with another project. We really have to stay committed over a very long time. And also then there's the legal and political strategies, which are not for me, but I realize their importance is, like, really critical. So partnering with people who can do that. And then I'll leave you with, see if this video works. This is the Iron Gate Dam is being dewatered or drained, and I love this imagery that we collected as part of trying to understand erosion, but it helps visualize the transition from a reservoir back to a river. And while it looks like a big mud flat, there's all these beautiful sort of processes that are happening as the river is sort of recovering itself. And it happens so quickly, and it is like literally in a matter of days, and it recovers like back to its exact same position, like with fidelity, where it was over 100 years ago. So when we could just get out of the way, the river is able to, So I'll leave that there, and then we can have whatever conversation you want to do.
Thanks. Question? Sure.
Yes.
You said you've been involved for more than 20 years, and you've dealt with an awful lot of regulators. Have the regulators you've been dealing with exhibited evidence of all the indications that you've been helping to provide?
In the state of Oregon, it has become a lot easier to remove a dam since 2015 or 2005, 2007. Regulators are still not easy necessarily to work with. It still continues to be obtuse at times, but there are individuals within these agencies who are lucky enough to get to work with them that are creative and solution-oriented and can help find those pathways, but there still continues to be barriers, like especially at the federal level, to getting good projects done. But within the state, it's become light years easier to get these projects done.
I will count that as a win.
Yeah, regulations can be challenging for sure. I'm not working on any dam removal projects right now. Partly because I'm still working on the Klamath. I guess I should say we're still working on the Klamath, trying to understand the longer term effects of it. But I'll be honest, I'm kind of bored with dam removal now. Like, you spend so much time working on it, and it's the same. It's like most of them are the same thing over and over again. So it's the curiosity. Like, it's no big deal. Like, the river recovers and it kind of moves on, and we're like left thinking something big was going to happen, and really nothing big happened. And so a lot of times that it's not as nasty of a problem as we thought it was 20 years ago, and so it's most of them are, from a science perspective, are not that interesting. But I think that's a good thing, right? Because it means, like, they're no big deal. Yes, salmon returning, yes. Is a big deal. But from a science perspective, there's less for us to learn. But there's still a lot of them happening. I don't mean to imply there's not a lot of them happening. American University doesn't really lead into that stuff, but from a science perspective, it's become less interesting.
I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I have a call tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. about this. So, we have we have around 1 million dams in the United States. They're all trapping sediment to some degree. Some of them are full of sediment and the sediment's just going over it. Some of them are still trapping sediment. And so one of the things that we're trying to move towards is a more sustainable approach to managing sediment reservoirs. One thing y'all should be aware of that's happening this summer is on the North Fork of the Toutle River. The Corps of Engineers is raising their sediment retention structure rather than considering like a long-term solution for sediment management. We kind of just keep kicking this problem down the road for the next generation to deal with, which to me is not ethical. And so I think there's a really important conversation that's sort of happening but needs to be more front and center about how we manage sediment in our dams, how we release that sediment, really allowing some of that to be released downstream. It's happening in the Willamette, but that's pretty provocative and uncommon. It's happening for fish passage here, but it's also restoring some of the capacity reservoirs, restoring some capacity rivers. But I think it's one of these sort of unacknowledged issues that our kids and grandkids are going to be burdened with in the next 100 years, which will give me a lot of anguish. But I think there are solutions there if we were willing to pay for them. Which is around how sediment is for our dams. Sorry for it.
Any other questions?
I'm so intrigued by this.